Hello and welcome to the School of Serenity. In this video, I want to cover an important topic that's not discussed much, which is whether science is truly unbiased when it comes to healthcare in general and mental health in particular. My goal is to show that the scientific literature is not as unbiased as you would think. I came up with the idea of creating this video when I was doing research on reflexology. Reflexology is basically an ancient method for treating mental illnesses by massaging arms and feet. Personally, I have found reflexology super helpful, and a lot of people that I know also feel the same. However, when I was trying to find scientific evidence of its effectiveness, I only came across two small studies from 10 and 20 years ago. This is interesting because when you look at other types of treatments that involve using medications, you normally come across tens or hundreds of published research papers. This begs the question of why there aren't many research studies focused on organic or holistic approaches for treating mental health compared to medication-based approaches. And the answer is pretty simple. It is because most research projects in the healthcare field are sponsored by big pharmaceutical companies. Since there are a lot of financial incentives involved in sponsoring these types of research projects, pharmaceutical companies obviously have a tendency of funding research projects that are aligned with their business interests. For example, according to recent statistics, about 75% of research projects that require clinical studies are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, and only 25% of such studies are funded by independent government agencies such as National Institutes of Health, NIH, academic medical centers, or voluntary specialty groups such as charities. This is in contrast to how research and science used to be conducted in the past, when a lot of scientists and research labs were sponsored by independent entities that did not have a big financial stake in the outcome of those research programs. As you can imagine, the involvement of pharmaceutical companies in sponsoring 75% of research studies can be problematic. For instance, according to critics and consumer watchdogs, Big Pharma's influence over clinical trials could allow drug companies to focus on the benefits of a drug and downplay the risks for the sake of profit. This biased information could also influence doctors to prescribe drugs more frequently without knowing all the risks. In this video, I'm going to explore three main ways in which Big Pharma's influence can bias the results of scientific inquiries. Number one, selection bias. What I mean by selection bias is that pharmaceutical companies tend to exclusively sponsor projects that are related to their own products, which most of the time are medications. Therefore, most research programs and clinical trials in the literature are going to be focused on using medications to treat symptoms. Not surprisingly, other modalities of treatment which do not rely on prescription medications are going to be disregarded because they are not in alignment with Big Pharma's financial interests. For example, as I mentioned earlier in this video, reflexology, which is a holistic and organic way of treating mental health issues, is going to be excluded from these types of research funds. As a consequence, medical professionals are unlikely to use these types of techniques because they are not proven by science due to lack of funding. Number two, survival bias. Survival bias refers to the percentage of research studies that are actually completed and published. Looking at the survival rates show that many of the research programs in which the findings are not favorable do not make it to the publication phase. In other words, they are censored from the scientific literature. Of course, many of the discontinued studies are the ones that did not provide sufficient evidence on the effectiveness of medications proposed by big pharmaceutical companies. In other words, many research projects are terminated as soon as their early results show that medications are not going to be effective as expected. Therefore, this creates a huge survival bias in the results of studies that are going to be published and made available to the public. Because it is in the drug company's best interest to publish positive results about their drugs, researchers rarely publish studies with negative results. This practice is also referred to as publication bias. This bias becomes evident when we compare the success rates reported in studies sponsored by big pharma companies compared to the success rates reported in independent studies. The success rate of medications or approaches proposed in research studies where the funding came from pharmaceutical companies is much higher than the success rates reported in independent research projects. Number 3, population bias. Population of individuals who are selected for research studies play a big role as to what the outcome of the study is going to look like. For unbiased results, the populations should be selected carefully to avoid introducing biases in the analysis. However, populations who are selected for research studies sponsored by big pharma are picked by researchers who usually have financial ties with the sponsors of the project. These researchers, in other words, have financial incentives to select the populations in a way that the research studies are more likely to yield positive results. It is not unusual for clinical trials to be run, designed, and analyzed by researchers on the drug company's payroll. So they design studies and report the results in a manner that is biased toward showing a favorable risk-benefit profile. I hope that you liked this video. If you have any suggestions or feedback, please add them in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss any of my future videos. Stay serene, take care, and thank you.